My name is Justin Adams. I work for the NASUWT at their head office near Birmingham. And tonight we're joined by Mick Burrows, who's going to be delivering a webinar to you looking at mental health first aid. Just to put all your minds at ease, your video and sound is turned off, so we can't see or hear you. And we will be sending you after the webinar a certificate to confirm your attendance, and also a handout that covers some of the things that Mick has discussed this evening. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Mick. I'll be monitoring the chat as well, so if there are any technical issues that come up, I'll try and pick them up. But I will pass you over to Mick, so thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Justin, and hello everybody. I can't see any of you. This is weird. Does my mental health no good at all? I'm talking to a picture of myself sat in my garage. So we've all been through a bit, haven't we, lately? Basically, I've been asked by the union to, this is something I do for all sorts of groups of members and also non-members as well. Basically, it's to do with providing you with some kind of insight into what goes on in the mental health of teachers like ourselves, what can affect it, how can we deal with those issues. And we sort of look in this little session at, the signs to look for in yourself, but also the signs to look for in your colleagues, because this is, we are a trade union, and trade unions, sort of the clues in the name, union, we look out for each other. I'll give you a little bit of introduction about myself first, which sort of elaborates on that point, maybe just a touch. And then essentially what I'm going to be giving you is a PowerPoint. When Justin referred to the handout, it's not essential that you take notes or anything like that. It's just a little reminder of what we've talked about, kind of thing. Don't feel you have to make notes or anything like that, but obviously feel free if you do want to. In terms of contacting me or talking to me, Justin's monitoring the chat, and when we finish the session, the PowerPoint, and we'll come back into the full room kind of thing, I can pick up on any points you want to raise through the chat. You may notice if you look in the chat, I've already put my own email address in there. I am quite happy to receive comments or questions or points, but I must make the point, I'm not a mental health therapist. I'm a history teacher who knows a bit about it, for reasons I'll tell you about in a moment or so. But feel free, if I can be of assistance, feel free to email me. One reason I say that is because I know that when we're doing this online, it's sort of different from when you're doing it physically and you've got to see the whites of each other's eyes. And it can be a little bit hard getting feedback from a group like yourself. And that's not to criticize anybody. It's just the fact we're all talking into screens and sat in little corners looking at computers rather than facing each other. So that's another reason why I give the email address, because there may be people who want to discuss something with me, but don't feel it's appropriate to do it in a screen situation or in a webinar situation. So that's what the email address is for. A couple of quick description or thumbnail sketch of who I am, because you're going to be listening to me for the next N minutes, however long N is. Obviously, my name's Mick Burrows. I'm a history teacher from St Helens on Merseyside. Well, I used to be. I had a nervous breakdown, as they call it, and that finished my teaching career about 10 years ago. So this is what my interest came into it. I was a national executive member, so I've sort of been part of the union for, 30, 40 years now. And it was while I was a national executive member that I had my breakdown. I'm not suggesting there's a link between the two, although there might be. Trying to teach and be an NEM was quite difficult. But it just so happened that the union was thinking of putting on a training course for members directly to deal with the mental health issues of teachers. And I was just coming back from essentially a nervous breakdown. It was suggested to me, because I was one of the still am one of the national tutors, Mick, would you like to learn how to be a mental health tutor? And so I jumped at it. So that's where my interest comes from. My other sort of involvement with it, apart from my own situation, is I'm a caseworker for the union. And there's a fair number of us about. Wherever you are working, there will be caseworkers. And our job is to support members who are in distress of various sorts. So I come across a lot of mental health problems among teachers as well. So that's sort of my background to it anyway. Hello, Northern Ireland. That's Rebecca. Nice to see you. Mental health is mental health wherever it is. So it's not like if I was doing a health and safety or an equalities presentation. Essentially, it's a presentation that applies to all of us. And a presentation it is. So I'm going to share the screen now. And I hope this works, because I can't see you. I can see Justin, or I can see where Justin would be if his camera was on. If Justin, will you shout me if you can't see this, right? Because obviously it's important that we do this.
I will do. Don't worry, it's working so far.
So can you? Thanks, Justin. Can you see that sort of title slide there, which is a sort of a tree in the shape of a head?
Yes.
Fabulous. Right. The thing you need to do is tell me whether it moves on when I click it, which I haven't done yet. So I've called this understanding signs because, frankly, getting in quick when you notice a colleague or yourself is not as they normally are is vital. And the sooner you can get in, the quicker and more easily things can be rectified. Sources of support, I'm going to spend less time on that because, frankly, the sources of support are medical or therapeutic, and I'm neither. I'm a history teacher, as I keep telling you, but there are places you can get them from, and I will reference them. So the key part of this really is the understanding the signs I would have suggested. I'm going to try clicking this now, Justin. For the last time, if you can tell me that has worked. Have we gone on to a different slide?
Yes, that's working.
Fantastic. I won't ask you again now because it's obviously running. Touch wood. Right. Now, normally, if we were in the room together, I'd be doing a little quick quiz with you and it'd be hands up or shout out the answers. I can't do that now. I can only see my ugly face. So I can't see what you're doing, whether you're putting your hand up or not. And I wouldn't be able to hear you all anyway. So just do this in your head and I'll give you the answers in a moment or two. Just to set the scene, this is an estimate. How many people are going to suffer from some type of mental health problem at some time in any one year? And there's the choices: 1 in 100, 1 in 25, or 1 in 3. How many will suffer from some type of mental health problem in any year? Second question, I say do it in your head. At any one time, how many people of our age, working age, are suffering with a diagnosable mental health problem? That's not just an issue with their mental health. It's an issue that is serious enough for them either to already have had a diagnosis from a doctor, or if they walked into a doctor's surgery, they would walk out with a diagnosis. So that might be anxiety disorder, severe anxiety, mild, moderate depression, severe depression, anything like that. And there's your choices: 1 in 60, 1 in 16, and 1 in 6. So that's of the working age adult population. And then the final one, because governments like to listen to talk about money, I'm not an expert, but GDP is essentially is what we make as a country in money terms. As a percentage of what we make in money as a country, how much does the mental health issue cost us? That would include treatment, lost productivity, sick pay, supply pay in a school, that sort of thing. Is it 0.5% of everything we make, 1.5% of everything we make, or 4.5% of everything we make? So there are my 3 questions to set the scene. I appreciate you can't answer them out loud. So let's have a look at the answers, see whether you were right. I bet you were right with the first one. The current estimates, 1 in 3 people will experience some kind of mental health problem. If that comes as a surprise to you, it is a surprise. What I'm interested in particularly is when I started doing this presentation, some years back, people were saying 1 in 100, 1 in 25. Now, when I ask that question, nearly everybody says it's 1 in 3. So I think at least there's an awareness there that maybe there wasn't a few years back, and that's got to be a good thing. So 1 in 3 will experience some kind of mental health problem, and it's 1 in 6 either have a diagnosis, or if they walked into a doctor's, would walk out with a diagnosis of a diagnosable mental health problem, clinical depression, clinical anxiety, something like that. Further, 1 in 6 wouldn't meet the criteria for getting a diagnosis, but they're experiencing issues. And for maths, people amongst yourselves, 2 1 in 6 equals 1 in 3. So that's where the answers fit together there. In terms of the money, it's in this little paragraph here. Now, this is out of date, 2014, but the estimate was about 4.5% of everything we make as a country is spent, and it's not wasted, obviously, but it goes on dealing with mental health issues, whether that's sick pay, whether it's insurance costs, whether it's medical costs, whether it's lost productivity, supply budgets, things like that. So it's lots of things, and it's costing us a lot of money. More about that in a minute, actually. 2018, so a bit more recently, the Department for Work and Pensions did a report on mental health in the work and came up with that stunning conclusion. You can see why they get paid so much, can't you? We face a significant mental health challenge at work. Well, whoopee-doo, well spotted. The cost that this report came up with was up to £99 billion a year. That's the monetary figure. Actually, the mental health first aid might do mental health first aid 2-day adult course. I'll tell you more about that later. Actually, you're entitled to attend as an NASUWT member. Turns you into mental health first aider, qualified mental health first aider. We reckon in mental health first aid it's 105.2 billion, so slightly more than they made it out to be. Those figures are just eye-watering and meaningless, aren't they, really? I mean, essentially, what's 99 billion? What's 105.2 billion? But essentially, it is the entire NHS England budget. So it's like on top of the budget, on top of what we already pay for the NHS in England, and I appreciate you're not all from England, but it's that size of budget, then we're paying as much again in dealing with mental ill health issues. So clearly there's a huge financial impact. There are more people, says this report, at work with mental health conditions than ever before. I just repeat what I said when we talked. 3 people will experience a mental health issue during any one year. I think we're just more aware of it. It may be that there are more people at work with mental health conditions. Probably after COVID, it is the case. But I think there's an awareness there that we're, and that's good. This is the scary one. Every year, 300,000 people who've got a long-term mental health problem, and that doesn't have to be schizophrenia or psychotic bipolar disorder. It can be mild, moderate, severe depression. It can be anxiety disorder, panic disorder. They lose their jobs every year. Now, bearing in mind that under the Equality Act, if it's a long-term adverse effect on you, that is a disability, then why aren't these things being picked up under the Equality Act as discrimination, disability discrimination? And certainly as caseworkers in the union, we do pick up on that and try and use that quite a lot. I'm not knocking people with physical disabilities by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying, how come people who have a physical disability are less likely to lose their jobs than people who have a mental health disability? There is a, I think it's easier for a manager to adapt the premises for physical disability. Managers tend not to know what to do about mental disability. I'll give you an anecdote. I like anecdotes. When I was doing one of these sessions for a group of members, I can't remember where or when, one of the members piped up with a story, and this is the story I'm going to tell you. This member was aware of one of his or her colleagues who was seriously under pressure, and we'll talk about what the kind of pressures are in a moment. Arrived at work one day in his car, it was a gentleman, got to work in his car, got to the car park, but couldn't get out of his car. He basically was in floods of tears. He was melting down. He was having a breakdown in his car. Somebody walked straight past him, looked in the window, and then carried on walking, did nothing. That somebody was a member of the school leadership team. Now, I am not suggesting that that member of the school leadership team was a nasty person, was some kind of a hot monster. I think it's more likely that he took a look through the window, saw the state that this person was in, and thought, I don't know what to do about it. Do I knock on the window? Do I open the door? Will I upset him more if he knows that I've seen him looking like that? Maybe he thought he was doing the right thing. He wasn't, because actually, as you'll see when we go through this, the best thing anyone can do is talk to somebody who's in distress, because that's a huge comfort for people. But I think it was because he just didn't know what to do about it. And I think that's partly behind that, what we see there on that report, 300,000 people, long-term mental health condition, lose their jobs every year. It's harder to adapt the workplace for mental ill health. So let's move on. Part of the problem with mental health, and it's one of the things we've been battling against, and I think we're beginning to win the battle, is what we call stigma. And this little slide here, you can probably see, I don't know, at the top, it's an NHS produced poster. You'll see all kinds of well-known words around there, which are very stigmatic, very negative, words that are used about mental health problems. And obviously you see the motto in the middle, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will also hurt me. And the person's obviously trying to escape from that. If you look at those words, they're reasonably tame. And I bet because you're working in schools, you'll have heard far worse than that, probably from the kids. There are a lot worse words than that. That's a fairly safe poster. Why are we talking about it? Well, think about this situation. Imagine yourself going through some kind of mental ill health problem, and you become aware that you're not yourself, you're not well, you're not right. you're not feeling right. You might be depressed, you might be hypertense, you might be anxious, you might be palpitating, might not be able to sleep at night, whatever. We'll look at some of the symptoms. Who are you going to tell? Well, you're not going to tell the kids in the classroom because they've got that language. Equally, you're not going to tell, possibly, you're not going to tell your friends because they've got that language as well. Or you're going to go to the boss and admit that you are not feeling well, or will he or she think you are a nutter, a fruitcake, loco, that sort of thing. And the biggest battle of all is with ourselves, because we've got that language in our heads. Now, I know from my own experience, I would not admit to myself that I had problems. Nothing got done about it. I had a breakdown. End of career. So it's really important that we overcome this stigma. We can never unlearn that language. What we can do is be aware of it and set it aside and realize how meaningless it is. But it doesn't help with the media, who have to sell their papers and things, don't they? This was a guy, some years back now, but you may remember it. This guy in the picture on the Daily Mirror, he flew an airliner full of kids into an Alp. And the Mirror's headline was, "Killer pilot suffered from depression." Well, I suffer from depression. Doesn't mean I'm going to fly a plane full of kids into a mountainside. Lots of people suffer from depression. Somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 people will suffer from depression at some stage. It doesn't mean we're all going to do something like that. The Daily Mail comes up with, why on earth was he allowed to fly? Well, actually, yeah, that sounds typically Daily Mail-y, doesn't it? But it is actually the most accurate one. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, I said I'm based on Merseyside, and if you know anything about Merseyside, yes, it's the sun. Madman in the cockpit. As I say, 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 people will experience depression at some stage. Are we all madmen when that happens? Are we okay to use a kettle, if we need a cup of tea because we're depressed? Serious point here. Are we compiling a list of jobs that somebody who's ever had depression must never have? You see how the stigma works. It's quite subtle, and you can see why there are these big banner headlines. It was pretty spectacularly bad what happened here. And actually, the guy it wasn't depression. He was psychotic bipolar. So he had a disability. He had a diagnosed serious mental ill health condition. That still didn't necessarily stop him from doing his job. What his employer should have done, because employers have a duty of care to us, is to monitor his condition. And if he was going through a bad patch, and they are fairly predictable with bipolar, by the way, then he should have been taken off flying. He wasn't. So that's why I said the Mail probably had it right. He shouldn't have been allowed to fly. He should have been put on all duties when he was going through his bad patch. The employer did know, by the way, they were aware of his situation. So there we go. That's the stigma. That's the kind of language that society speaks about mental ill health. Madman in the cockpit, cuckoo, loco, screwball. Doesn't help when we're trying to get people to say, I've got a problem and I need some help. If you broke your arm, that would be a different matter. Slightly embarrassing. You come back with your arm in a plaster, everybody would write rude things on it, but all have a giggle, and a few weeks later it'd be all right. If you've got a broken mind, it's different. And that's because of the stigma. Okay, let's move on to a section that I'm going to run on stress now, because stress is, as teachers, and many employees, but especially teachers actually, stress is the mental health condition we're most likely to come across. And I'm going to start by saying, actually, it isn't a mental health condition. I'll explain it in a moment or two what it is. This is how I characterize it. Apparently, I'm told as an MHFA instructor not to use the word bucket, because apparently that's rude in some parts of the country. So I deeply apologize to anyone I'm offending, but to me, it's a bucket, right? Call it a container if you want. Let's call it a container, be on the safe side. That container is inside all of us. We all have one. And some of us have a very big container, some of us have a very small container. But interestingly, that container doesn't stay the same size. It can grow, it can get smaller. And the smaller it is, the more likely it is in that situation you see on that slide to overflow. And if we imagine that the overflowing of that container is the nervous breakdown, the mental breakdown, that sometimes called emotional snapping, that is what we're trying to avoid. Now, the tap at the top is stress. Work as the main stress, and we're probably right. But don't write off other stressors. You may have physical issues, you may have family issues, you may have relationship issues, you almost certainly have some financial issues because you're a teacher. At the early stage of your career, so I mean, there's more coming out of that tap than just workload. You'll notice, and I apologize for my awful IT skills, that tap should be fastened onto the bottom of the bucket at the bottom there, as you can probably work out. I would now ask you, if you're in the room, what do you make of that tap? And you would all shout out as one, it's some sort of release. It's letting the pressure out. It's letting some of the water out. And it is. So essentially, it's a dynamic diagram. If more water flows in than flows out, the bucket will tend to fill and overflow. If as much water flows out, the level will stay the same, equilibrium, fine. If more water flows out than flows in, brilliant. No, there's hardly any, it'll all drain away. So that's the sort of model I use for stress. And as I say, some of us have a huge container and we can cope with all sorts that life throws at us. Some of us have a much smaller container, but we are bloody good at getting rid of the water inside it. And it's around about this time I would normally ask, does anybody want to share what your coping mechanisms, coping strategies are? What's your tap at the bottom of the bucket? How do you get rid of the stress in your life? One of the messages of this presentation is we should all have a knowledge of what works for us. And I can't tell you what will work for you, because what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. I will give you a list shortly that suggests, these are the kind of things that we can do about stress. Remember also, I talked about, some of us have a huge container, some of us have a small container. That container changes in size day by day. It's like when you get out of bed on the wrong side. Things can build up on you, or some days you let the world throw what it wants at you. The problem comes when we have a very small container. We might be knackered, we might have got an awful lot of pressure on us, and then watch that tap at the top. Ofsted inspection, letter of parental complaint, lesson observation, whatever it might be, really tough class that's played you, whatever it is, something is the final straw that makes it overflow. And unless we work that bottom tap, we're in danger of snapping. And that's where how stress works on us. Now, I told you that it's not a mental ill health condition, and it isn't. Stress is a perfectly natural function of us as animals. And I love that picture. That illustrates exactly what it's about. Stress is there to tell us that we are in danger and we need to do something about it. All right. And it's done through chemicals. You'll have heard of adrenaline. You might have heard of cortisol. They're both stress chemicals, particularly adrenaline. Focusing on adrenaline, that guy in the picture there is flush with adrenaline right at this very moment. He has been clumsy or silly enough to stick a spear in the mammoth, and the mammoth didn't like it. The mammoth has turned on him. Now he has got various choices. The adrenaline's pumping through him. I'll tell you what the effect of that is in a minute, but there are 5 recognized responses to adrenaline now. There used to be only 2, and you'll know those: fight or flight. I bet you know that. So they were the first 2. There's now 5. Fight, turn around, pick up a boulder, hit the mammoth. Not my choice, I don't think. Second one, flight, run like hell. That's exactly what he's doing, and I think I'd go for that one myself. The other ones are freeze, in which case you stand still and hope the mammoth doesn't see you. Not a lot of chance there, actually, but it might work. The fourth one is flop, where you essentially shut down. But what it's doing to you is making you play dead. So that in this particular example, the mammoth thinks there's no point trampling on you because you've already died. The fifth one, and this has only been identified by the medical profession in the last 5 years, is friend. And in that particular case, he would turn around and stroke the mammoth on its trunk and offer it a bun like that. Now, translate that into the school situation, because we don't work with mammoths generally. You are under stress. Stress is a bad condition. Your body pumps out adrenaline, as it's designed to do. What you do with that adrenaline then is one of those 5 responses. Fight, you become incredibly irritable, you become tetchy, you snap at people. Flight, you escape from it, and the problems just pile up. Freeze, you sit there, for example, a pile of marking to do in front of you, and you just can't raise the pen to do it because you're frozen. Flop, you essentially collapse, probably sleep for hours on end. And friends, you mark that set, and then you get another set, and then another set, and then another set, because you're making friends with the workload. So it's a very dangerous setup. It's perfectly natural, but in a work situation, it's actually very dangerous. Let's have a look at some of the things in work that cause stress. And again, this is the kind of thing I do out loud if we're in the room together. Management will impose it on us. It's probably worth remembering that I think it's 12% of our members are actually managers. So we're not having a manager bashing session here, because it's worth remembering that the managers themselves are under pressure because we've got this accountability regime that sets school against school. We all want the big sign outside in England saying Ofsted say we're outstanding, Estin in Wales, and etc. So the accountability regime drives managers to try and get bums on seats by selling their school, which means they sometimes pile the workload on us. Workload tends to come down from above, doesn't it? Our colleagues can put workload on us. It might be that they're slightly less than competent. It might be that they're lazy. It might be that they don't know they're doing this. It might be inadvertent. Either way, we can sometimes sort of absorb by osmosis workload via our colleagues. The kids, of course, particularly since they've returned from COVID, with the lockdown, it's been quite tough. Kids naturally, part of their job description, create problems for a teacher. I think sometimes there are mechanical reasons for that as well, by the way, if you're interested. We can normally cope with that, but when we're stressed, that really becomes an issue for many of us. Yeah, there's the COVID era students. And the COVID-related stressors themselves, it's perhaps getting less. I don't know if you believe we're getting out the other side of it or not. I have my doubts, so I'm not holding my breath. I hope we are. But there has been an awful lot of additional stress in terms of our own health, our loved ones. What are we taking back from this festering nest of viruses that we work in when we go back to our home and see our grandparents who might be vulnerable or whatever? There's all kinds of stresses, plus the ones when we're working at home, because there's been a lot of that, obviously, primarily during lockdown, but also when bubbles were sent home and things like that. You get an anxiety. Am I doing it right? You get a guilt. I shouldn't be at home. I should be in work. So there are COVID-related ones as well. And sadly, we do it to ourselves. And it's probably comes under that friend response to adrenaline that I mentioned. I'm knackered. I've marked 5 sets of books here. I've got another set to mark. I better mark that. Well, no, you better have a rest because you'll be a much better teacher the following day. So it's that sort of thing. That's what I mean by self-inflicted. So that's how it can affect us. But remember, it's not just the workplace. There might be other things as well that are contributing to filling that container up. Stressors for school staff. Yeah, these are the COVID ones. I was sort of alluding to that before. Personal safety, our safety of loved ones at home. Are we doing the right thing, particularly when we're working at home? What's the assessment framework going to look like? We think we know, but are we sure? It keeps changing, doesn't it? What are Ofsted going to be doing? Well, actually, we know more about that now. Ofsted are going to be in like a ton of bricks in England because they've already started. Can't speak for other nations, but in England, certainly Ofsted are on the warpath. They want education up as if nothing had happened, which is crackers. Sorry, that's a stigmatic word, but you know what I mean. Generally, we're concerned about our students. That's why we're teachers. We care, and we're worried about our students. And are they going to cope? Have they coped? Are they safe? Are we going to be able to get them the exam grades in secondary that they need, or are we going to help get the education they need in primary? Mention that. Let's have a quick look at this. Average class of 30 kids. The kids in front of you actually already have their problems. 10 will have seen their parents separate. 8 have experienced physical violence, abuse, or neglect. 7 will have been bullied. And 1 will have experienced the death of a parent. So time management, yeah, without time management, we just can't cope. It's fundamental. By time management, what I mean is draw lines across the calendar of your day, or your timetable, if you like. This is when I stay in until, this is when I get up. This is the time I start work. This, and this is the important one, is the time I stop work. And the rest of the day is your own. And yes, you might not have finished the work, but tough. At the end of the day, if you overlap that line on a regular basis, you are going to go into a downward spiral, and the work you do will be of a much lower quality. And no manager who cares about their workforce should allow that to happen. As I said, we have a contractual right, all of us, to a satisfactory work-life balance. Very hard to explain. You can't really measure a work-life balance. I always use what I call the duck analogy, which you've probably heard. If it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. So if your work-life balance feels like all work and you've not got any time for yourself, then probably you don't have a very good work-life balance. You don't need to be able to measure it to tell when it's out of kilter. Your family are really important to you. Now, it may be a family that you live with, you know, the nuclear family, you, partner, kids, maybe, whatever. It may be that you are part of the nuclear family with parents. It may be that you live with housemates. So I'm using family in the broadest sense. Other people, I guess I should have put there rather than family. They're vital because they take your mind away from the work. It may feel like they're distracting you, but actually they're helping you. Do you remember hobbies and interests? You're perfectly entitled to have one. And that's part of the duck theory. You've got time to pursue some of the hobbies and interests that you'd like to, then there is something wrong with your work-life balance. There should be time in the day for everybody to do things for themselves. Not because you're lazy, not because you're skiving, but because you need that in the interest of your own mental health. The downside of that is if you don't have that, if you don't take those kind of things up, if you don't manage your time like that, you can end up, as I said, in a downward spiral, and that's going to do the school no good at all, because ultimately there's only one outcome of that: you're off sick. Creativity. When I had my problems, I started oil painting. Now I'm the world's worst artist. My paintings, I wish actually I could pick this thing up and take it through into the room and show you. They're on the wall, they're dreadful. People come round, we have a giggle about them now. But actually doing them really, really helped me. Now, it doesn't have to be oil painting. Play a guitar if you can do that. Sing in the bath if you want. Do a bit of knitting. How about cooking, trying a new recipe? Any creative will help. And this obviously has to be done, bear in mind your time management. That's done in your time. Don't forget your rest and sleeping patterns. I'm not your mum. I'm not going to say you need 8 hours a night. You might do. Find out what works for you. For me, 7.5 works fine. I feel fine after 7.5. My best mate, if he has any more than 4, actually feels groggy. He thrives on 4 hours a night. So find out what works for you and try and build that into your time management, into your pattern. Exercise is the number one, because think what we're talking about: stress, we're talking about adrenaline, aren't we? Running away from a mammoth. That's what it's there for. So exercise is essentially the running away from the mammoth that the adrenaline is in our bodies for. So there are no mammoths to run away from, but there's gyms to go to, or there's go out for a walk, or get on your bike, or if it's chucking down the rain and you're self-conscious and you don't fancy doing that, just walk up and down stairs a few times. There's so many ways that we can do exercise that don't necessarily involve pumping iron and bodybuilding. You know, just keep active, really. And that helps burn some of that adrenaline off. Your diet's really important. When we're stressed, that's one of the first things to go. Have you noticed? Oh, not bother eating, I've got too much to do. Or I'll grab a pot noodle, or I'll order a takeaway in. Now, I quite like pot noodles, and takeaways are some of my best friends, but you don't need thrive on them. You know, you don't rely on them constantly. Try and get your diet right. And again, that fits in with the time management, because you need a time for your meals. Fits in with family as well. You know, let's have a family meal together. Might fit in with creativity. I'll cook it. You know, there's so many things you can do. All of these things will reduce stress. You can also drink. You can also have lots of coffee. You can also smoke. You can also, other substances are also available. Any one of those can make you feel immediately better. However, they are a different breed of life for, because although they will help in the immediate, or they may make you feel they help, actually they don't, they make you feel they help, then ultimately they cause more problems if you do it too much. All right, now this sounds a bit nanny state-ish, doesn't it? But I drink, I smoke, I'm a caffeine addict. With me, I know how much I have in a day. Probably too much, actually, but I know how much I have in a day. The key thing to look for is change in behavior. Did I have 2 glasses of whiskey before bed last night? If so, there might be a problem. And you remember I called this presentation looking for the signs, learning to see the signs, spotting the signs. One of the signs is a change of behavior like that, perhaps. So are you smoking more? Are you drinking more? That could be a sign that you need to look at your lifestyle a little bit, perhaps. So remember those things. Obviously, if I've had too many glasses of whiskey, I'd end up alcoholic, which is stupid, because I'd be very, very sick. And actually, that leads to more mental ill health problems. And also, I'd run out of money, so I'd have financial problems. So you can see how it can block up the tap at the bottom. This is the big one because we're a trade union, aren't we? The strength to say no. And I'll make it go red because it's that important. What I mean by that is what it says, but I don't mean you have to be rude to a manager or somebody who's putting workload on you. You can be quite polite. You can be quite professional about it and say, yes, I see the importance of that, Mr. Head of Department, Mrs. Head of Department. What don't you want me to do? Or what shall I put off while I do that for you? So you can be quite professional about it. We're all grown-ups. We're all professionals. We're all committed to the job. None of us can do the impossible. But as a union, if it's a workload issue in the school you're working at that you are suffering from, ask around other members, because the odds are if it's affecting you, it could affect others as well. And then we act as a union and we sit down and we request a meeting with the head teacher or our representative or whoever does, and sit down and we'll have a sensible, peaceful, constructive discussion and try and resolve the issues. And then and only then, if we need to, we'll get the big stick out. But I mean, do remember we are in a union for a reason, and that's because, you know, what hurts one hurts all of us. So let's have a quick drift through mental health continuum. Now, I've taken 40 minutes, which is about normal for now. I'm not going to spend ages on this, but because very few of you will actually get the serious side of this, the issues of this, but some of you will. It's worth knowing, I think. First thing to say is it's a continuum. You can be anywhere from no serious, and that isn't, you're not a fixed point. You know, I'm somewhere to the left of the centre. You might be further to the left of the centre. There might be some amongst us who are further right of the centre towards the more serious, but you're not fixed. You move. Sometimes we have problems. Sometimes we have less problems. Even if we've got a diagnosis, provided we're getting the treatment, whatever that might be that we need, we can move across to the left, you know, even with a serious diagnosis. The symptoms get worse, obviously, the further you go across. From the left, they would be just the classic stress symptoms, probably digestive problems, palpitations, sweating, a bit of hyperventilation, difficulty sleeping. They're typical stress symptoms. That's caused by adrenaline, they're adrenaline symptoms. Right through to psychotic delusions and hallucinations on the right-hand side. So there's a whole range of symptoms there. I will put stress about there. It isn't very scientific. And as I said to you before, it's on the left because it's a natural thing that happens to us. It is perfectly normal. It's there for a reason. The problem is we're not designed to have high loads of stress for a long period of time. We're designed to run away from that mammoth, and then we either get away or we get killed, and that's the end of the stress. We're not designed to carry it week after week after week after week. And if it's allowed to build up, it can lead on to more serious problems, such as, classically with teachers, anxiety. Anxiety, we'll look at the symptoms of anxiety in a minute, but essentially it's stress squared. With a teacher, and this is based on my experience as a caseworker, because we tend to be caring people who are committed to the job, we're off work with anxiety, we're fed up, we're sat at home, we're watching daytime television. I know because it happened to me. And you think to yourself, it's 11 o'clock on a Thursday. That will be 8x4. I wonder how they're getting on now. Who's teaching them? How are those kids getting on? Have I let my department down? Have I let the school down? Have I let the kids down? Have I let the parents down? Am I the weakest link in the school? You see how it's beginning to build up, and you start to blame yourself for being ill. Now that actually is the route to depression. And it's actually quite common in casework when you look at the sick note of a teacher who's off with mental ill health problems to have a diagnosis of mixed anxiety and depression. It is quite common among teachers that. They can both be treated. They're not terminal. You know, if the treatment is done and it's caught in time, they're fine. Not treated, you can end up in psychosis. And you can actually graduate straight to psychosis without passing through the other stages first. And psychosis we'll talk about in a moment or two. Sadly, all the way along this continuum is self-harm. There's about 5, 6, 7% of teachers admit to self-harming now, not the kids, the teachers. There are eating disorders, which are actually recognized as a separate form of behavior to self-harm, and sadly, suicide. So we are somewhere along that, and it's up to us to be aware of where we are and do something about it. Skip that because it's a bit rude. So let's have a quick look at anxiety. Right, I had to use that picture. There's anxiety for you in a picture. The symptoms, as I say, it's stress squared. They are, again, primarily adrenaline related. So your heart beats fast. That's to allow you to run away from or fight with the mammoth. You're breathing fast, same thing, to oxygenate your blood, ready to do that. You sweat a lot because, again, that cools your body down. Interestingly, by the way, your muscles tense up, which is why anxious people very often fidget or tremble or shake or pace up and down. It's burning adrenaline off. That's what they're trying to do. Their body is forcing them to do that. That's the shaking that I talked about. You can't concentrate. Now, it's very important I explain this to you. What adrenaline does, apart from get your muscles pumped up to run or to fight or the rest of it, is it turns the blood supply off where it's not needed. And one of the places it's not needed is the rational, logical part of your brain. You don't weigh up possibilities when a mammoth's charging at you. You either run or you fight. So it sort of works on the instinctive part of your brain. Now, if you translate that into a teaching situation and you're staggered under a load of workload, the one thing you need to do is to be rational and say, well, I can prioritize this. I don't need to do that right now. There's no point worrying about that. I'll just concentrate on these things. In other words, rational thought, prioritization. But you can't, because that bit of your brain is starved of oxygen, and it's the instinct, fight, flight, freeze, flop, friend, whatever, that takes over. So that's why we have an inability to concentrate with anxiety. Irritability is linked to the fight reflex. Sleep problems, surprisingly, when you're pumped full of this kind of hormone. You don't eat properly because, as I say, your digestive system's not being fed with oxygen, and you basically subject to irrational panic. It becomes a disorder when it's long lasting, and actually that affects your life. And if you've got those symptoms consistently and at a high level, it will affect your life. And a lot of teachers get that. Depression, say that's what my diagnosis is, known as the black dog, because Churchill called it that. My year 11s used to love that picture of Churchill. I used to love putting it up there on the board for them. Symptoms, it isn't being miserable. So if any of you haven't had depression or experienced depression, you may want to know this. It's not a question of feeling sad. It's more a question of feeling nothing. Lethargy, not because you're lazy, but because there's no point. Your mind can't see a point in anything. And as a result, you either sleep too much or you don't sleep at all. You lose your appetite because food doesn't frankly taste of anything. You lose your libido because that doesn't give you any pleasure anymore. In fact, it's tied in with that bullet point there. Total inability to enjoy things. It's like the world suddenly gone into black and white or colorless. All the flavor and the color's gone out of the world. You can't see anything positive, no matter what people say to you. So if you come across somebody who's depressed, don't say cheer up, because they can't. The guilt that I talked about before is classic. You start to blame yourself for feeling this way. That can lead on to self-loathing. And you can see, actually, it's very commonly linked ultimately with suicide if it goes too far. Not surprisingly, it's very hard to deal with a relationship. If you've got a depressed person in a relationship, the other person has to be very, very patient and tearful, because you do get this emotionalness. You probably can't explain why you feel it, but you get it. Now, if you come across somebody who's got anxiety or depression, the best thing you can do is talk to them, or actually more to the point, get them to talk. There are differences in the way you do it. If you're approaching an anxious person, first of all, think very carefully about how you approach them. Don't approach them while they're busy working, because if it's work related, you'll just make it worse. Maybe take them out of work, go for a walk at dinner time, burn off some of the adrenaline, get them to talk. With depression, it's slightly more difficult because the person will probably reject your attempts to help them at first, because they won't be able to see any point in it. Very important that you persevere and you say to them, well, I can see you don't want me now, I'll give you the space, but I just want you to know I'm here for you and I want to help you. And that will get through to somebody with depression, and they will appreciate it. So they're just sort of like little snippets of the mental health first aid sort of course that we do. There's a lot more detail to it than that, but getting the person to talk is important. Quick look at other mental health conditions. This first lot are all anxiety. They're all from the family of anxiety. Panic disorder, I bet a load of you will have had panic attacks, and you will know, as I do, that when somebody says, oh, I'm having a panic attack, they aren't. If you're having a panic attack, you feel like you're at death's door. You have no idea what's happening to you. You're you're literally in a blind panic. If you come across somebody who is in that situation, and you will probably at some stage or other in your life, if you haven't already, again, the secret is to get them to talk, but you're doing that to control the breathing, because the panic gets them to breathe hyperventilating, and that makes it worse for them. So the best thing you can get them to do is to control that breathing. The best way to control the breathing is to get them to talk. Be very careful what you ask them for reasons I'll explain in a minute. One thing you ask them is, tell me how you're feeling, because they can tell you that. You might want to try distraction. Look out the window. Tell me the first 10 things you see out that window. They might not really understand why you're doing it, but if you get them to do it, they're talking, it's taking their mind off it. What you mustn't do is mention the word die or life-threatening, because all they will hear in the panic is, you're not going to die, but to them will sound like you're going to die. It's not life-threatening, will sound like it's life-threatening. So don't mention that at all. Just talk about other things. I came across a PE teacher who dealt with panic attacks by chucking a basketball at the sufferer. Not something I'd recommend, but the person had to catch the ball, instinct. They caught the ball. And he said, right, throw it back. And they did that backwards and forwards to each other until the panic attack subsided. So distraction works, but the key thing is to get the breathing under control. And I find the best way to get them to talk. And the best thing they can talk about is how they're feeling. Also ask them, have you ever won before? You don't need to tell them that it's not life-threatening, because if you get them to think back, yes, I've had one before, then you see the penny drop. Yes, I had one before and I'm still here. So I'm not necessarily going to die. So it's sort of without you saying it, it can help get that going. Forget acute stress disorder. They're the same thing, essentially. These are essentially panic attacks based on the result of a trauma. And I had a really, really sad story once when I was doing the mental health first aid course of a teacher, an NASUWT member, currently off ill, diagnosed with PTSD. She had worked in a residential school, like a boarding school type thing. I don't know what it was exactly. And she was in charge of what in posh schools would be called a housemaster. So she had kids under her charge, sort of thing. And she just, a lad in her care took his own life, hanged himself. And it was her that discovered it. Now, the little lad was 12 and he had blonde hair. That trauma burnt itself into her consciousness. So now, whenever she saw a kid with blonde hair, she immediately went back to the moment of discovering the dreadful sight of this child who'd taken his own life. So, and there's a lot of kids with blonde hair, aren't there? So you can see she was currently off work. Now, it can be treated. All this can be treated. But the way it would manifest itself if she saw a kid with blonde hair is she would go into what is essentially a panic attack. Hyperventilation, thinking the world's going to end, feeling awful. She's reliving the panic that she felt when she found that child. Now, this is why you have to be careful with any kind of panic attack, whether it's PTSD or whatever, because you might not know. Don't ask them what's brought it on. Because if you're asking them what's brought it on and it's a PTSD related panic attack, then you take them back to the blonde-haired kid. Because if you say what brought it on, this teacher would say, I saw a blonde-haired kid. Oh, and she'd be back in it again. So it's best not to ask what's brought it on. You may not know whether they've got PTSD or not. You probably won't. So just don't ask. Just concentrate on how they're feeling. You can reassure them, I'll stay with you. Don't worry, everything's going to be all right. I'll stay with you. We'll send for help. That's a good idea, actually. Send for help, because the symptoms are very similar to a heart attack or a severe asthma attack. And, you could be trying to control somebody's breathing or throwing a basketball at them when they're actually dying of a heart attack. So do send for help. And it gives you something good to say as well, like help's on the way. Just waiting for help. Everything will be all right. It's reassurance, really. Phobias, again, we've all heard of arachnophobia. There's loads of them. It's actually a very, very serious and very rare anxiety disorder. And again, with arachnophobia, it's not, I don't like spiders. It's, if I'm arachnophobic and a spider appears in my vision, then I am literally back in a panic attack. You see, all of the anxiety disorders result essentially in panic attacks. OCD, another favorite of mine. You cannot be a bit OCD. If you're OCD, you are seriously disadvantaged with your life, because you have this constant obsessive thoughts, intrusive, unwanted thoughts. You've no control over them. They're in your head. Sometimes accompanied by voices. It's semi-psychotic. You to do something to sort of keep the voices under control. There was a kid who was constantly switching a light on and off, on and off, on and off, on and off. Couldn't stop him doing it. They took him for treatment, and under treatment, they discovered his intrusive thought, his obsession, was that his parents were going to die. And the way that worked, and there's no logic in this, was that he felt if he kept working that light switch, he was compelled to do that as the compulsion, he would keep his parents alive. So there's no logic in it. He can't explain it, but that's just very real to him. So you can't be a bit OCD. And if you stopped him, by the way, he would have a panic attack because it's an anxiety disorder. Quick look at psychosis. You've heard of bipolar, obviously very, very high, very, very low. But if it's psychotic bipolar, which it quite often is, like the guy who flew the airliner into an Alp, when you're on the high, you may have delusions of grandeur, invulnerability. I can fly. It's quite dangerous. And when you're at the bottom end, then very, very serious suicidal voices, critical voices in your head, urges to do dreadful things. It can be disastrous until it's diagnosed. Very hard to diagnose because everybody's pattern of ups and downs is different. And sometimes you have to see several of them before you actually spot there is a pattern. Schizophrenia is the classic psychotic illness where I came across somebody whose brother was schizophrenic, and when they were having an episode, they're not like that all the time. When they were having an episode, they thought that the druids were coming to sacrifice them. Now, to them, that was real. If you come across anybody with a psychotic crisis going on, don't argue with them. Don't tell them there's no druids. Equally, don't agree with them. Don't say, yes, there are some druids. Try to get them to talk. You probably have to send for help, but to say something like, well, I can't see any druids, but I can see that you're really upset and I want to help you. Use short sentences, use their name and your name a lot. So that's a sort of very quick trot through other mental health issues. Suicidal thoughts, much more common than you might think. The scary figure on these, or scary two figures, 5 or 6% of people, adults, have attempted suicide. If you work in a secondary school, there's probably about 100 plus staff there. 5 or 6 of them on average will have attempted suicide. 16 a day, slightly more. If this was a sort of regular 24-hour, if they were spread over 24 hours, we'd have lost probably about 12 by now, every day in the UK. 75% men, quite possibly because men don't offload. Can also be to do with the fact that men tend to choose more immediate methods of ending their lives, whereas women tend to take an overdose. So it could be actually roughly equal numbers attempt to take their life, but because women traditionally, if that's the right word, would go for an overdose, they can be stopped. But if a man jumps in front of a train, it's very hard to stop him. And there is a direct link with stress. Quick look at teacher suicide, shot up with the Tories came into power. We went political, so I'll ignore it. Forget I said that. The rise is going up, and it is going up higher than other professions, I'm afraid to say. That was prior to COVID. I don't know what the figures are now, to be honest with you. It tends to be the older teachers, so you lot being largely ECTs in England, isn't it, or whatever they are in the other nations as well. You're probably all right for now, but watch yourself. So remember, with stress, your self-help, look after your sleep, look after your eating patterns and diet. Time management, really, isn't it? Try to keep as active as you can. You don't have to pump iron, but just try and keep active. Give yourself some me time. And try breathing, the breathing exercises that you get loads of them off YouTube or on the net there if you want to try those. Forget that because we haven't got time. In summary, let's go to the summary slide and then I'll knock off. So to finish, the key thing is changes in behavior, changes in appearance, changes in attitude, changes in habits. Look for the signs both in yourself and in your colleagues. Look for the changes. And remember, if you see changes in a colleague, try and help them. It can stop problems developing. Look after yourself. Remember your work-life balance. And finally, remember we're a trade union. If you've got problems, then probably everybody has. If they're work-related, let's act together. So there we go. That finishes that. There's my email. You've already got it anyway. I think twice in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I realise we're almost, in fact, we're bang on time, aren't we? I don't know if Justin's there. There's loads of chat, isn't there?
Hello, yes, there is. And I've seen a couple of people who missed the beginning asked if you'll get a copy of the presentation. Yes, you'll get a copy of the presentation and a certificate emailed to you, hopefully tomorrow, but maybe the day after. But thank you, Mick. That was really, really
I'm really sorry to rush everybody. I just got carried away. Plus, we had that glitch, didn't we, in the middle? That probably explains it. Anyone can get in touch with me, remember, if you want to. I'm a very lonely man. Feel free to email if you want to.
There's lots of people saying thank you in the chat.
Yes, I've got it up now. Oh. Handle a pupil. Yeah, with pupils, it's very, very difficult. The principles are the same. Get them to talk, but have one very beady eye on safeguarding. With an adult who's depressed or anxious, you can agree to, unless they're going to self-harm or take their own life, you can agree to confidentiality. With a child, you have to be clear with the child and say, I want to listen to you, I want to help you, but it's very important we get the help that you need. So I need to contact Mr. or Mrs. whoever the safeguarding lead is. So you have that conversation if you've got time, but you must make it clear to the child that it's got to be referred, and don't ever not refer that. Safeguarding, well, does safeguarding trump mental health? Probably it does in a school. It shouldn't, but it probably does. Oh goodness, there's loads. I tell you what, if you is there any way that you can, Justin, you can send me this list of questions? Because I don't think I'm. What locations do we? I can do some of them. What locations do we hold the 2-day course? All over the place. Just look on the website. As a new teacher, what's the best way of trying to see the school culture before applying to the school? Ask the local secretary that the school is in, and if you go to your regional centre, they'll be able to tell you. Get a list of the members, and maybe try and contact one of our members and ask them. There is no other way. Walk around, you can feel it, but maybe talk to the school rep if we've got one. That's a really good way of doing it. Anything specific triggers panic attacks? No, pure panic attacks can happen at any time. But obviously PTSD and ASD related panic attacks are linked to the trauma, and OCD is linked to an interruption in the thought or action process. Mindfulness and meditation, yes. If I'd have had more time, I would have spoke more about it. It works. Please look into that. It does work for a lot of people. Funding for the 2-day mental health first aid course. All the school has to fund is supply cover for you being away. It's free to NASUWT members. Yes, thank you, Emily. Everybody, me included, needs to establish a work-life balance. You'll be a better teacher for it, I promise you.
One other question as well, anonymous in the Q&A. I don't know if you spotted that. Someone said, just wondering if you had any thoughts on working through lunch breaks, teaching marking books. Well,
well, yeah, I do. I have a trade union thought, and I have a serving teacher thought. The trade union thought is they cannot force us to work in the lunch break. Plus, every worker, not just teachers, is entitled to a lunch break of a suitable and sufficient length to allow them to recuperate and recover. As a teacher, I know that practically you end up setting up the afternoon school. What I would suggest you do is try and, before it becomes too stressful and you can't rationalize, work out what the priorities are. Maybe don't mark books, maybe concentrate on setting your lessons up and find another time within your schedule. But we're all different. It's a question of sitting there and listing what needs to be done, and then what are the priorities at this time. What I wouldn't do is not have a break. You must get some sort of a break in your lunchtime. It's there for a reason. Okay, you might want to cut it down to 15 minutes or so and work the rest, but do have a break in there sometime, because it'll build up on you otherwise cumulatively.
I can save a copy of the chat, so if there are any questions that we haven't picked up, I can mention to Mick, and we'll follow up on them after, if that's all right with you, unless you want to carry on.
No, it's entirely up to everybody. I don't mind. I mean, how long's the call on for you? You know,
this and until it ends. It's there's no time limit on it.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't want to keep you either, Justin, because it's your time as well.
I think you've picked everything up.
If there's anything that I haven't, if there's anything I haven't, will you get in touch with me, Justin, and then I'll try and provide an answer that you can possibly send to the person if you know who it was, obviously, or send to everybody if it's anonymous.
Yes, and if there's if you think of anything after this that you've got Mick's email address as well, but you can also contact our member support team. The email address for that is just advice@mail.nswt.org.uk. So you can contact our advice team anytime to ask for confidential advice on any work-related issues. Even if you just want to bounce some thoughts off people, we're here for you. So don't hesitate to contact us.
Yes, but email, you're right. That email is there for a reason. And if there's anything that I've not answered, feel free to get in touch, and I'll do my best. Remembering the rider I put on it, I'm not a therapist. I'm a history teacher who's got some training in mental health first aid. That's what it amounts to. But I will help if there's anything you need. I'll just put feel free to email in the thing. Yeah. You've got the address anyway.
Yes, yeah. The primary point of contact would be our advice team generally. Things. If you need any advice, as I said, it is confidential. So thank you very much, Mick. Have a Thank you for giving it your time this evening. It's much appreciated. And thank you all for coming and attending as well. We've got a few more webinars taking place. There's one tomorrow, which is Staying Safe Online. And then next week, I think we have assertiveness. We have assertiveness and your induction rights. So that will cover some of the things about your lunchtime working and things like that. But we'll email you all details of those. You should have already had them, but we'll send them again. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
All right.
Good luck.